Good morning and welcome to Top of the Morning. Today we've got a really special, positive show. I'm here with Derrick Smith. Derrick, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you doing that and sharing with us what you're doing. Derrick is the young black mayor, and when we finish, you're going to understand why that's important and what that means, because he's on a mission, a very special mission. And we're going to talk about his book, Oklahoma Black Facts. There's so much in that book that I think will startle a lot of people, a lot of Oklahomans who think they know about the history of Oklahoma, who think they know how this place got started and got framed and what it's about. There's just so much to consider. And before we start, I want to say I love the way that you would have, it made it really easy to read too.
Right.
It's an easy read, but you finish each page with some, cogent, succinct fact. And at the bottom it says fact.
Facts.
And I like the way that you did that because you invite people, think about what it means. It's a fact.
Right.
This is a fact. What does it mean? What do you think it means? How does it fit? So to me, that's how I read it, and I liked it. It's like, okay, that's a fact. In context, what does it mean? So for me, that was fascinating. But Derrick, as we begin, I'd like you, if you would please, just share about yourself.
Okay.
Who are you, where you grew up, how you got interested in the history, who influenced you and how you got started.
Yeah, so my name is Derrick E.D. Smith Jr., and I was born right here in Lawton, Oklahoma. All right, born and raised on the south side of town, Lawton View. My roots go to Tatum's, Oklahoma, an hour east of here. So I was raised there as well. Got lucky enough to be raised in two places. Tatum's is a historically all-black town, one of the 13 that still exist here in Oklahoma, which has more than any other state. And so my purpose and my identity, more than anything, is really how I got into the history of Oklahoma, the black history of Indian Territory, which is super, super important. And I'm just really on a mission to educate as many people as I can with regard to the black legacy of Oklahoma and the contributions of African American people here.
Yeah, and you have a rich history in this community. You have spent some time at Cameron too, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
About 5 years.
Okay, so you're just well grounded in this area, but still you came to know things that were obscure to other people. You developed what they call a high level of erudition and recondite information. You over time began to compile facts that were hidden from other people. I mean, and people would argue hidden in plain sight maybe. But for instance, I didn't know that the American Indians owned slaves. And I didn't realize how that complicated the interaction and the growth out here in the West, and that there were blacks on the Trail of Tears. Would you help us a little bit? You mentioned there were 13 black towns. People don't know that either. There were 30 at one point. What is a black town? What does that mean? Frame it for us, please.
Yeah, so the 5 civilized tribes are the only tribes that had, black or African slaves. They were largely mixed blood groups of people before they were removed from the southeastern United States. So we're talking about the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole, which Seminole has a very interesting or unique identity, a little different from the other 4 of the 5 civilized tribes. Well, they were largely mixed blood groups of people before they were removed from their homelands in the South and placed here in Indian Territory. So when you learn about the Trail of Tears, if you're lucky enough to learn about it, you tend to see that as one of the biggest moments of oppression for Native Americans. And if you're not ever told that there were lots of Indian masters on those trails with enslaved black people as well, then you just will never understand the dynamics of black life here in Oklahoma, which was Indian Territory first. And so with the 5 civilized tribes owning slaves, they fought with the Confederate South during the Civil War to uphold the institution of slavery here. Okay, with this not being a state and it being the territory, black life became a lot different from anywhere else in America. Okay.
Yeah.
We became emancipated from the tribes. The last to be free was a year after the United States in 1866. A year after what we know as Juneteenth, that just became a national holiday. So, you know, interesting dynamics all around. But once we became emancipated, freedmen or former slaves didn't really have citizenship in the 5 civilized tribes or the United States. The Chickasaws, more specifically, the freedmen of the Chickasaw tribe, didn't have citizenship until 1906, 1907, when Oklahoma became a state. So for 40 years, from 1866 to 1906, freedmen of the Chickasaw Nation, where I'm from, just an hour east of here, my roots go to, did not have citizenship. Okay, what we did was build out black towns, completely independent, self-sufficient towns. We had no choice. And so there were upwards of 100 black towns and settlements here in Indian Territory. Black men were empowered as U.S. Marshals in 1875 with the great Bass Reeves, the most feared lawman in American history.
In the book?
Yeah, the Buffalo Soldiers came into Indian Territory in 1866. They built Fort Arbuckle first. Well, they didn't. They were stationed at Fort Arbuckle. Fort Arbuckle, which is just about an hour and 15 minutes east of here. They were there stationed there first, and then they came here and built Fort Sill in 1869, 1871. And so black life was very different with regard to the level of freedom black people could have in Indian Territory. It was not a state, so it was not overrun with non-black government and authority yet. And so black life was just different. A life of freedom and protection like no other place throughout America.
You know, all fascinating. I was a little surprised. Maybe I'd heard it before and forgotten that the 5 tribes fought with the Confederacy. You know, initially I'm thinking, why are you into that? And I really didn't know that there were Confederate battles out here.
Yes.
You know, in the West, and that's in your book.
Yeah.
There's so many unique and I think important facts that are brought out and elucidate many of the points that you just made. I think that's all really good. One of the things that was very interesting to me was this promise of a black state.
Right.
You know, you talk about the blacks coming west or opportunities, and because it wasn't a state, some unique opportunities, because if you went far enough and you were isolated, you were on your own.
Right.
But this notion of a black state, if you would talk about that a little bit, please.
Yeah, so sometimes you may hear that Oklahoma was supposed to be a black state. People that say that typically know more so about the Boomer Sooner movement. That's what they're referring to with the unassigned lands, with the first land run that took place in 1889. Technically, by treaties that were eventually made between the United States and the 5 civilized tribes, those freedmen of those tribes, if they were not integrated into the tribes as citizens, they were going to have the right to move on to those unassigned lands. So this Boomer Sooner movement, you have a black state movement taking place at the same time. So a lot of times people are referring to that, but it goes even deeper. In the book, you know, a bill went before the House in 1866.
That's a great point, because people don't know that. It wasn't just talk.
Right.
There was a bill.
Yes, sir.
It wasn't voted on, but nonetheless, there was
for Oklahoma to become an all-black state or a black governed state.
Yes, yeah. The bill was written.
Right.
So this wasn't just a pipe dream.
No.
It had a political basis, and I guess the boomers represented the white folks that were very much against that.
It's really interesting because so many Oklahomans don't really know what Boomer Sooner is. They don't really understand the culture. They might have heard that it's about land runs, if they know anything about it. And so it was a great movement for people to capitalize on land that was not assigned to any native tribe yet. You know, the unassigned land, it was 2 million acres right in the middle of Oklahoma. So Oklahoma very much became a promised land to African Americans as well. you know. And that's the part of the Boomer Sooner movement that doesn't really get told. You know, and it's really important because that Black State movement, there was formerly an organization known as the Freedmen Oklahoma Immigration Association that inspired the leader of the Boomers. He actually really wanted to work together with the black folks
Really?
to open the unassigned land, but he passed away.
So there was collaboration.
Payne, the first leader of the Boomer movement. Okay, David Payne. And so
Interesting.
once he passed away, the leadership of the Boomers was very much different. If people were going to get land, it was not going to be black folks before it's white folks. And so you had that dynamic, especially back then in
The
that
politics
culture
of
at
it.
that time.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I talk about whether there were black Boomers and whether there were black Sooners, and
But there were black Sooners.
absolutely,
Yeah. Tell us about that a little bit.
yeah. Well, do you understand what a Boomer is versus a Sooner?
I think so.
Because, you know, the call and response, especially if you've been to an OU game,
Oh, yeah,
somebody
yeah.
gonna call out Boomer,
Yeah.
and somebody gonna respond Sooner.
Yeah.
You know,
Not in this context.
not in this context.
Yeah.
But Sooners, who was worse? Who was the badder of the two? Is basically what the call and response is about, or who was better or nice or worse? I'm not really sure. But you know, it's different for everybody. But it's a call and response. So Sooners were simply people who left a little bit ahead of the gun when it fired off at noon during that first land run. You know, maybe they went in the night before and staked their claim and camped out. But the Boomers lobbied for a decade up in Washington, coming in on the land, squatting on the land, you know, many excursions in the winter, different efforts to be able to get in on that land and stay on that land, you know, for a decade prior to it opening up. So that's the difference mostly between Boomers and Sooners, and then you get into some other dynamics with both groups. And the Buffalo Soldiers, it was their job to drag the Boomers off, the squatters of the land, and take them up to Fort Smith so they could go to court. And so,
And it's a full circle. Very interesting.
right.
One of the other things that struck me when while I was reading your book, all the different groups. I mean, there was diversity inside the diversity.
Right.
You know, and so they're freedmen, states Negroes, black Indians. The $5 Indian I thought was kind of quaint, and then blacks exodusters. That's the first time I'd ever heard that.
Oh, yeah?
If you would just tell us about the different, I guess, players or participants in the era.
Yeah, so with Oklahoma becoming a promised land to black people, you know, the freedmen of the tribes were involved and included in the land domain. So freedmen had a lot of land here. Just like a citizen of the tribe, if a freedman could farm 100 acres without stepping on anybody else's toes, they were entitled to do so. So the closer Oklahoma became to becoming a state, freedmen got land during the Dawes Rolls, formally. Even if you were an infant baby, if you were registered during the Dawes Roll, even as a freedman, you could get 160 acres of land. And a migration from the South of black people coming into Indian territory to collaborate with these black freedmen that have this land, or these black Indians. Many of these freedmen were by blood members of these tribes, and that was their culture and their lifestyle. You know, they were black Indians, you know. And so you had what became known as states Negroes, black people that came into Indian territory to partake in the land domain and build out black towns.
And
have
they were
self-governance.
formerly slaves in the Deep South, right?
Freedmen from the South.
Yeah, okay.
They were freedmen from the South, outside of Indian territory. And so you had a dynamic and a back and forth that was created within the black populace.
Now, the states Negroes were referred, I guess, disparagingly by some as Wachina.
Right.
Please explain what's going on there.
Yeah, so the freedmen of the tribes, or the black Indians, they began to feel like so many states Negroes are coming in. They're not native to this land like we are. And they're going to mess it up for us with regard to citizenship that we're supposed to have within our tribe. These 5 civilized tribes that have kicked the freedmen out, essentially. And so
they're competitors.
States Negro, Wachina was like an Uncle Tom, you know, just a different culture. They saw them as
they're competitors.
You know, exactly, competitors in a sense.
In the same way that Boomers and Sooners were competitors, all the players, the tribes, and that's one of the things that really resounded to me. There's a complexity here.
Right.
A lot of different players, and the complexity is not what we think. So to me, it's fascinating. That's what I loved about your book.
The Exodusters.
Yes.
They came a little bit later.
Yeah.
Okay. In the South, in 1865, when emancipation took place, you had Reconstruction that began. You know, to reconstruct the South and the government and the relationship with black folks, obtaining these rights through the, you know, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and things like that. Well, by the mid-1870s, the troops were pulled from the South, and that's when things started to go back real bad. You know, we have sharecropping coming in, and essentially black codes, essentially a re-enslavement of black people through different systems in different ways. So you had a migration of black people from the South into Kansas beginning in the mid-1870s, and they became known as the Exodusters. They started lots of freedmen colonies and communities in Kansas before coming down into Oklahoma.
Very interesting. And then the last, of course, a $5 Indian.
So when the Dawes Rolls took place, which Henry L. Dawes was working on behalf of the United States government to form a commission, the Dawes Commission, to enroll the Native Americans in Indian Territory, to determine who's enrolled as a tribal member. That way they can work towards becoming American citizens and to push statehood in Oklahoma and Indian territories, because there was 2 territories eventually. And it was pretty easy for a white man to pay $5 to be added as a by-blood citizen on the roll. And so you have this dynamic of non-native people who don't necessarily have blood being able to become tribal citizens legally and formally on paper, which is what matter most when it comes down to it. That's what matters most, whether
so it's
you were enrolled or not.
Important that the viewers understand that the $5 Indian was not an Indian.
No.
He just someone who paid to get on the rolls,
Right.
because that gave them an advantage. Yeah, thank you for that, going through those groups. I think that's fascinating. So in 1907, Oklahoma becomes a state, and seems to take, based on the conversation up to that point, make a hard right turn toward, I guess we would say moving backwards. They segregate everything.
Absolutely.
You know, and they play hardball with it too. Your book says if you have any black ancestry, any at all, you're black.
The one drop rule.
The one drop rule.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And that means that you are discriminated against as much as anyone else. So they're playing really hardball with that. So the black state never voted on, as you said. The Boomers and Sooners, you explained what that's about. But in your book, and I want to make sure I got this right, you say that there's just as many blacks as whites in Oklahoma in 1905.
Yes, sir. So the 2 territories, Indian Territory after the Civil War, and once many of the tribes began to be placed here, the 5 civilized tribes originally were placed, they owned all of Indian Territory. But after the war, they were made to give up about half of Indian Territory. It kind of split Oklahoma in half. And so on the western half, you had Oklahoma Territory, and then on the eastern half, you had Indian Territory. Okay. And so most of the black towns and settlements were in Indian Territory, but there were some that were in Oklahoma Territory. And more specifically, Langston, Oklahoma was founded and plotted during the land run of 1889. So you had a lot of black people that came, in addition to the black people that were here in Indian Territory, to participate in that first land run. And Guthrie became a city overnight. And there were lots of black people there already. And by the time Oklahoma moved into statehood, there were as many black folks up in Guthrie and in Oklahoma Territory as white folks.
That's fascinating.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Oklahoma Black Facts. And I look forward to seeing you next week for the next episode, Top of the Morning.